Welcome everybody to welcome to spring. Pastor Gardener Society is probably one of the places that you go to get the vibe that says, oh, it's spring, but you don't need too much of that right now. You just walk outside. There's snowdrops and snow crocuses trying to bloom in a couple places where I've been today. So I'm glad to be here. I think most of you know, sorry, I have to get rid of the recording notice there. I think most of you know that I've been gardening professionally for a long time, although I am currently retired from gardening physically for people. Steve retired a few years ago and I retired last year. We're trying to focus on books and our writing. But for 40 years, we kept our heads above water gardening professionally, and we loved it. We also, there's not advancing very quickly here today. We also got pretty dirty and met a lot of really wonderful people, gardeners, and what they think about doing in their yards, what they do in their yards. It's fascinating to us. When we were writing, a lot of you know me from when I did my 13-year stint writing for the Detroit News and Free Press on the weekends. It was a question and answer column. So was our article in the Better Homes and Gardens magazine and in Fine Gardening. They were question based. And we got so many questions from people that made us stop and think, wow, can that happen? Yes, that could happen. It expanded our own experience geometrically to tell us all the different things that could happen. And it taught us so much in looking up answers and rooting around looking for the people who had the answers, that as we wrote them down, we said, we need to keep these and we need to start giving them to other people and making sure that this stuff stays out there. So we kept writing, Michigan Gardener for 10 years, a couple of books, and most of our writing now is on gardenatoz.org, our website, where we're trying to put all that we've written so that we don't have to write it again. So we've got it in one place. We have several thousand articles up there already. I'm not exaggerating when I say that, and we still have more to put up. And we'd be pleased if you go there if you're looking for an answer, or you can always email us if we're not at a presentation like this. There is an outline for today's presentation that you can download from our website. If you go to gardenatoz.org, or I'll shoot one over if I didn't already to Amanda, and she'll have it for everybody. In fact, Amanda, I should have you get that PDF number right now. Give me 1 second. I should have thought of doing that while she and I were talking a bit ago. If I go to gardenatoz.org, don't we just hate how things get in the way when you're trying to see? There we go. If I go to gardenatoz.org and go to our webinars page and to the audience materials, it happens to be one of the first ones we did, and it's called Getting the Garden Ready for Spring. There it is. And if I download that article, I'm going to get a PDF pops up on my screen that I can download that's got what you see there in front of you. I'm typing that into messages right now. And that's the PDF. There also, that particular time that we put that up, there were a number of questions from people that generated what we call a chat transcript, where there were questions left in chat that still hadn't been answered, or that we said, we need to get a little bit more on that for you. So we wrote those up separately. So I'm going to put that into your chat now too. And if you're not experienced with using chat, then you can ask Amanda, who's very experienced at doing that stuff, to do it for you. And I'll come back over to here. There we go. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking to you about is what I've been doing and what Steve's been doing for the last 40 years. And some of you who've heard me talk before, I really appreciate you coming back in again, will recognize some of these things as, well, we've heard that before. We haven't thought of any newer ways, better ways to do what we've been doing. There are some things we've definitely learned along the way, but our overall procedure stays the same in the spring. And it's a chronological sequence that I follow here. So I'm going to take you through what we do starting in late March, as soon as we can get into the gardens, and through April, and then progress through the year. We won't have time to go through all of it tonight, but we'll be able to get through everything that you can be doing now, and you'll have the outline that says what else is going on from there. Plus, maybe we can get back together and talk again at another time. So the topics that I put into this are, I start with pruning the woodies. That's the very first thing that I do. Most of us have more of them to do than you might think if you start adding them up. Then I cut down the herbaceous things that are going to be cut down, herbaceous being the stems that are not woody, like peonies and daylilies, things that you left up over the winter for the birds, or maybe because they looked good. And then I move into raking, why I rake, fertilizing, what I fertilize with, how we fertilize. And this is sequential. This is what I do. Then we start in on the edge, cleaning up the edge of the garden, then weed the garden, then start looking around for the trouble that's going to come up, because even this time of year, even this early in the year, you can see what's going to happen during the year. The signs are there that tell you what's going to happen, you know what to look for. So if we get to that, I'll show you a few of them. Then we start out dividing plants that need dividing and moving things around and changing things, putting some mulch on what we've done, and then planting some cool season annuals. So we won't get through all of that, but it's all written up in this outline for you, and I'll take you through it. This is the garden that Steve and I used in our book, Caring for Perennials. We use this as the example of following a garden through the year and everything that happened. It is at Michigan State at the Jalapa Perennial Gardens, and it currently is where it was a full sun garden when we were there. This tree is now, I'd say the trunk is about as big around as across my shoulders now. And this whole area is shaded by trees. So it's an entirely different garden now. And it's interesting to look at that. We've talked about maybe going through and seeing what the differences are in time. But that picture that you just looked at, that was in May. That's after doing everything that I'm going to talk about today. A lot of times people wait until May. They figure they don't need to be gardening until then, or that it's not right to garden before then, or it's too early to be walking on the bed. You go from May, the picture that you just saw, to this right here, that's only 3 weeks time. Things just jump out of the ground. If you don't get a jump on them before they jump out of the ground, you're going to be behind all year long. So long about now, during the times that you really think, oh, I'm not going out there today. It's too miserable. Last week was miserable. It went from being melted in huge puddles to being slick ice to snow on top of it. It's crazy, but there are things that you can be doing, and that's what we do as soon as things melt off of them. And I start with pruning as plants are coming into leaf. This is a leatherleaf viburnum. It's one of my favorites to use as a screen in a partly shaded area or a shady or particularly shady garden, because in most winters, it keeps its leaves from the year before. It keeps its leaves until the next year. And then the new foliage that's coming out here kind of pushes off the foliage that was there before. This picture was taken after a particular winter when the leaves fell off, probably because it was pretty dry in January. I'm just realizing something else I forgot to do here today. Let's go back over here and make my pointer bigger, because how can I point anything out to you if I've got a pointer that's so tiny you can't even see it? And that always makes me clumsier, because once I make the pointer big, it's like walking around with a huge stick. Okay. So I'm looking at the woodies to prune them, because things are jumping up out of the ground. The daffodils are up. They came up, they've gotten frozen. They're frozen, the ground is frozen around them. It's not going to stop them. They're going to keep coming up. These are all it changed the name of it, Campanulata spanica, called bluebells, English bluebells. They bloom in the woods, or in this case, we use them underneath the hydrangeas. And when they come up that far, when they're already up that far, trying to walk around that shrub to work around it, you're squashing the whole year's show. So we get out there early. And if it's in the snow, that's okay. This is blue mist spirea, Caryopteris. Some of you grow this. It's a great plant. It's a woody plant. It's a shrub, but we keep it cut all the way down to the ground every year. We treat it as a perennial. It still blooms because it blooms on new wood. And this is all 1 year's growth. It gets this big in 1 year. So this can be cut down anytime that it's dry. This over here is a herbaceous plant. We're going to wait on that until later. That's Amsonia, or what is willow Amsonia? It's called blue something. Blue star is its common name. And it looks nice in the winter because it keeps that tawny kind of color, which goes with the tawny color of the Caryopteris. So we leave that clump up, and it's time now to take that down. because that bed's going to look like this later. Here is the Caryopteris coming back up as the annuals are coming up into their own. It'll bloom in August. The Amsonia is back over here, has already bloomed in the spring, and is now just the background for other plants. Evergreens are something that can be pruned this time of year. If we prune them before they go into active growth, we can redirect growth a lot more easily. And it can be a little bit harsh. Some people say that they can't do that. They're afraid to do that. You have to get a little bit of afraid. I talked to a gardener, an apple orchard owner, who was a second generation apple grower at the farmer's market. And we were talking, Mr. Masters and I, one time about pruning. And he said, you know, if I go out into the field, into the orchards when the guys are pruning, if I'm not scared at what I see on the ground, then they haven't pruned enough. So even for somebody who lived his entire life, and at the time I talked to him, he was in his 70s, watching things be pruned, and still you think, oh, it's too much, I can't take that much off of it. This false cypress started as about, it was maybe 20 inches tall when we put it in. Now it's the size we want it to be. Now is the time to start pruning it. And spring is a really good time to do it. So I'm going to take it and prune off parts of it. So for instance, the first thing I've done is taken the top down, because we can't let it get any higher. I've taken the top off to a point where I can say, now you can grow from that point. And then I'm taking the sides in too. So it's going to end up looking like this. Started out like this, ends up looking like this. And I took a lot off of it. I took several bushels of foliage off of it. Didn't spend a lot of time doing it because I knew what I was doing. And I'm trying to keep it looking irregular and natural. I don't want it to look like it's been sheared. So I took off the top. I went through and took on where the side branches, see where they were sticking out. I followed those branches back and clipped the branch off, left the inner branches that are still coming out to let them grow. These branches, these tips here and here that are extending themselves like a little pyramid, those have become dominant. And if I take those off before they begin to grow this year, before the buds begin to open, the buds behind them, these, remain in a subordinate position chemically. They don't grow outward great fast like it does when you prune your yews when they've started growing and they get antennas that stick up all over the place 3 days later. That's not going to happen. You're going to get a very nice, clean look that stays that way. So here's a top that I took off. I took off the top all the way down to right here, right below here on the remaining on the plant are 2 branches. Like this. I took it off down to a branch like that. And that left me with one branch that's a little bit taller. See, this one's a little bit further up than this one. So if I let those 2 grow, this one will become dominant because it's taller. I can assist the process by clipping this one even shorter and leaving just one on the top. I don't have to worry about straightening it up. It'll straighten itself up. It's a chemical process that happens in the plant for it to straighten itself up. So I'm cutting so that I'm cutting off enough that I don't have to cut that plant again for another 2 years. I'll show you how I figure that here. So my cut leaves, see these guys right there? That's a branch. In fact, this is a branch. That's not a leaf. Those are the leaves are the little tiny things that are pressed on the stem itself. But this branch coming out right here is going to be able to take off and grow, and it'll become a new top later on in other years when I cut stuff back. Now, when I cut the side branches off, I'm cutting back more than 2 years growth. I'm cutting back into the plant, back to a small side branch like that, so that I give that branch time for 2, 3, 4 years to grow out and fill out the plant. And when I say 1 year's growth, do you see the difference in the color of the wood? Here's bark and bark. And notice the bark is getting lighter colored, almost a yellowy color as it gets up here. In the year that just formed last year, this bark is still green, yellow. This is 1 year's growth, about the length of my hand pruners here. So here's 1 year's growth. If I want to cut it back so that it stays this size that it is for 1 year, then I need to cut it back so that all of its tops don't come any further up than this, so that they can grow that much again, and then you cut them again. So I could cut this branch out down to here and let one of these side branches take off. But I don't want to cut it every year. I want to cut it every 2 or 3 years. I want it to keep that irregular shape. So I want to cut it back so that it goes 1, 2, 3 years as far back as I'm cutting it. So this is cut back 3 years, and I won't have to cut it again for another 2 or 3 years. If you've got questions about that, because we can't stop after each thing that I'm doing, or we'll never even make it past the pruning the woodies today, type the question in a chat. It's there. We won't lose it. We'll be able to scroll back through and find it. And if we don't get to it, I can make it a chat transcript and we can do an email exchange afterwards. This is the hibiscus, the panicle hibiscus, excuse me. This is the hydrangea, the panicle hydrangeas that are so popular now. Like this particular one is called Ivory Snow, but they're the ones that are real popular are Limelight and Burning Embers, and one that's called Firelight. But they bloom on new wood in late summer, and that's what you like them to do is fill late summer with color. They are way too big for this area. They never should have put 3 in here, but landscape architects do that kind of stuff. And so we have to keep them cut in order to keep them within the area. So here they are in March, late March, and it's time for me to cut them. The new wood, dark brown, is a different color than light brown, the older wood. So I can tell what grew last year, and you can tell you can tell that this whole shoot is brand new. This plant can grow from here where it's gray all the way up to here. It could grow 3 feet, 4 feet in a year. So if I want to keep it the size that it is, I got to take 3 or 4 feet off of it. And I want to take 3 or 4 feet off of it that allows it to keep having new wood. Young wood is more vigorous on shrubs. So I want to take out some old wood and cut the others back. So they end up looking like this when I cut them back. They're going to bloom every year. I cut them back that hard. And every year in August, that's what they look like. And that's what we want them to look like. We don't want them to be 10 feet tall. We don't want them to be hanging out over the steps. We want them to be just that size. So to do that, I have to tell you that in the spring, both Steve and I do the same thing. We stand there and look and think, we can't do this. It's just too much. It's just, I always push us with what I remember my dad telling me when I was little: just do something, just get in there and do something. Once you start doing things, it comes out and works out a lot better. So the first thing I do is cut out the oldest wood. And I'm going to have to flip back and forth here for you to see this, because I was taking the pictures myself here, and I don't always, when I've got my pruners, remember to take a picture in time. I took the oldest wood out. See the thickest light colored wood here? There's one back here. There's 2 in the front here, and they're right close to each other. I took those right out, right down to the ground. I'm not worried. They're going to come back. There are buds down at ground level, and they're going to grow back from there just the same way that this grew up from there. So the first thing I do is take out the oldest wood, because I want some vigorous new wood, like this one that's coming from the ground, this one that's coming from low down on the plant, this one that's coming from low down on the plant. Those I'm going to keep, and then I'm going to shorten everything. I'm going to shorten everything so that it has 3 to 4 feet that it can grow without before it blooms and not getting things away. So after I've cut the old wood off, then I take what I've left and I shorten it to a pair of buds. See the buds that are sticking there? I'm asking that plant to grow from there. I'm asking this one to grow from this point where those buds are. I'm asking this one to grow a number of branches from back there. Whatever you leave at the top, right below your cut, is the branch that's going to become dominant. And those are the branches that are pointed. You want to try to pick buds that are pointed where you want them to go. If you look at these branches, you'll see that there's a pair, because it's a viburnum. They're in pairs. The buds are in pairs, just like these twigs are in pairs. And the buds are on, say, the north and south here. And the next buds down here are on the east and west. Plants do that in order to put their next tier of leaves, to keep it from shading the tier below it. They rotate their leaves. So I can choose whether I want my new branches to go this way or to come out into the inside of the plant. And I choose to have them go out toward the outside of the plant. I really don't want branches crisscrossing inside like this one did. So this other one that's more toward the back, I'm getting ready to take out the old wood. And I'm taking out, it had not been cut well for a couple of years. We've trained people how to do these at this property, and they're still too tentative. So down here, they'd left a knuckle that keeps getting more and more full of little shoots coming off of it. So I took the knuckle right out here and here, leaving me with these branches that I then shortened. And the picture that you saw of them blooming is this same year, months later when they bloomed. They do bloom. It's a good idea to take a look at all your shrubs. This is another type of viburnum, one of the leatherleaf viburnums like I showed earlier here. But these people want to keep them quite small. And leatherleaf viburnum is a big shrub. It wants to be 12 feet tall. So they keep clipping the top. And every time they clip the top, because plants have that tendency for the top bud to become dominant, more of the growth happens at the top and very little growth happens on the inside. So you end up with a hollow shrub in no time at all. This plant needs to be thinned out. It's got all these branches competing to put leaves, big leaves. These are smaller ones that are left on here, big leaves all in the same space. This needs to be thinned out and leave some buds down here to grow, to give some growth down further in. So that's thinned out. Can you see where at the bottom, say the bottom center right here where my pointer is, there were 3, 4, see these two real close together, branches all coming up in the same space. But I don't need those. I like this one. It's got some buds lower down. I'm going to keep this one. I'm going to keep one of these two in the back, and I'm cutting the rest of the clutter out of the middle so that these buds that are on the branches here and these new shoots that came up and were so spindly because they were in the shade have a chance to grow and fill out the bottom part of the plant. So that's evergreen and herbaceous woodies, a lot of them. There are a couple more that we'll do, but I moved from, sorry, not herbaceous, deciduous and evergreens that I cut back. Then I move and take a look around at the gardens to say what needs to come down. There are things in this garden that we left up for the winter time so that there would be some interest. Rue back here, there was an ornamental grass. I think we took this picture after I'd already started cutting the ornamental grass down. It's time to get those things out of the way and take a good close look at the plants. So I'm cutting down the previous year's herbaceous debris. And you do it for looks to a great extent, but also for sanitation. The oldest parts of the plant down toward the base, especially the bases of the oldest stems on a perennial, are where you have the greatest accumulation of fungus and bacteria and insect eggs and resting bodies. Those are the things that you want to keep cleaned up if you can. What I show you here is looking at a cluster of a perennial, like most perennials, that is becoming bigger every year, and the center is becoming hollow. The growth in the center is less than the growth on the outside, thinner stems, not growing as well, dead spots in it. So I end up with dead spot in the middle and livelier growth on the outside edge. This plant is telling us, I'm getting old, I need help, I need to have space where I can, these shoots even in the middle can grow some new roots. So we're cutting down to take a look and see what things are going on there. And that includes things like cutting down the stalks that were left from last year's daylily.
Yay.
This is in, this picture that you're looking at here is the 1st of April. And already the daylilies are coming up and things are starting to grow, and people worry about, well, I can't cut what's already growing. You can cut what's already growing. There's no harm to the plant to cut off what's started to grow. It's still got plenty of time to grow from the buds that you leave it. And I don't want the old debris on daylilies. There are a lot of daylily streaks and rusts and daylily leaf spots that make the daylily look terrible after it blooms, that are worse if you leave the debris that's feeding, that's feeding the growth of those spores on the new leaves that come up. In fact, I found in this particular instance, after treating some of the daylilies differently than other daylilies, that it was better to cut the foliage down. That early in the year, daylilies, which are silly lilies, they grow very early in the year and they tend to get burned back by frost at some point later on. The damaged leaves on the daylilies tend to have more problems later in the year than cutting them all off and letting them grow back again in a little bit milder weather. So I cut them down. And I cut down at this point the woody plants that we're treating like perennials. This is spirea, one of the Japanese spireas. I'm pretty sure it's gold flame. I've kind of forgotten. It might be gold mound, but they get to be about 3 feet high. And we'll cut them every year or every couple of years all the way down to the ground. And behind them in the grayer wood back here is a butterfly bush. Those I'm going to cut down. So it was an hour and a quarter, 75 minutes to cut 5 shrubs and in that area, and 4 beauty berries, calicarpas, just off to the side here, cut down, bundled up, and gone out of the way. It looks like they're gone. They're not gone. You cut them all the way down. If you're cutting a woody plant back to ask it to grow you new branches, then you want to cut so that there's not any stubble for you to trip on or to get in your way for subsequent cuts. Because 2 years from now, you're going to have to cut again, and there'll be stubble in there. And then 2 years later, there'll be more stubble in there. You want to cut them as far down to the ground as you can possibly cut them. If I don't cut them now, if I don't cut them early in the year, in this case, my client didn't come back from her winter place in South Carolina until May. And then she called me and said, "Can you help me with the pruning of the garden?" I said, it's late to be doing some things, Judy, but this is one of those spireas. This one is not gold flame. It's a relative, and we treat it the same way. It's already started growing, but I still cut it down. I cut it down, and it's harder to cut down then because I had to cut around the newest shoots. I wanted the old wood out completely, and I wanted to leave some new shoots. And that was a lot pickier cutting than to just cut the whole thing in one go. And 2 weeks later, there it is, coming up strong. And it can't be any bigger than we cut it back to. There's just no room in this particular garden. What Judy likes is variety, as many different kinds of things as possible. And that means that everything in there has to be grown as small as possible. And they do get big. Plants get very big. In the house that Steve and I are in now, which is new to us this last 6 years, we had a 39-year garden, and now we move into someplace else. This shrub presented itself to us at the garage door, and I said, well, that's got to go out of there. That's a Weigelia. It's in the way of everything. It's too big a shrub to be put in that little tiny space that no builder should even leave us to try to plant something in. And it actually it's tied up with bungee cords, we found, holding it up so it wouldn't get in the way. I said, well, that's got to get out of there. But it wasn't a big priority, so I cut it down. It was in end of February, beginning of March, after we moved in. I sawed it off. I said, I'll dig you out later. Here's what it did that May. It said, oh, well, I'm still here. I'm still alive. I didn't get around to cutting it out. Here's what grew in the first year that I left. It grew this far in that first year, but by that time was getting in the way of getting in and out of the garage, so I cut it back. So don't worry about cutting these things back. Weigelia will bloom on new wood, just like spirea will bloom on new wood, and you can cut it back. I still haven't gotten that one out of there. So many other areas became a priority, and I will eventually get it out of there. And here's the stubble situation. You don't want to leave this stubble. This is at a client's, and she emailed me one year. She said, okay, so I've cut down the hydrangeas. What else do I need to do? I said, well, I'm not sure. It's been a while since I've looked around. Let me come by and look. And I came by and looked. And I said, Catherine, you've got to cut more than this. Right now, the only buds that this can come from are from these little tiny pieces that you leave up here. So it's going to be weaker, smaller stems coming from smaller stuff. And they're all competing with each other. So here's what you need to do. You need to saw out some of those knuckles that you've created in cutting this back. And that's what you should be leaving. And when you're doing this in the kind of weather that we've had recently, when the soil begins to thaw and the top level is thawed, as it was last week and for most of last week and up until tomorrow, then the soil at the top, which has crumbs in it, crumbs being the things you really want in soil. Crumbs are pieces of, are accumulations of particles in the soil. Usually there's a little bit of clay at the center. clay particles that electrically, statically, there are other particles sticking to that might be sand or some silt and some humus. And then microbes of various kinds and worms and things move in and deposit microbial glue that helps hold the whole thing together. You walk on that this time of year when there's ice below it and you're a hard foot above it, and you pulverize it. You break the crumb apart, and it's not going to come back into being a crumb in any short order. It's going to become a dense, hard layer. So if you have to go out this time of year, put boards out to walk on, put out bags of newspaper where you walk on bags of newspaper as each bundle of newspaper as if it's a stepping stone. Or I have little snowshoes. My daughter is modeling for you here. We have 2 pairs of snowshoes, Steve's and mine, and we'll wear those to spread your weight out so that you don't do as much damage. And don't take the leaves off. Leave the organic matter that's absorbing some of the pressure. This, when you stand on 1 foot, when the gardener reaches up and stands on 1 foot, you are putting more pounds per square inch pressure on the soil than a bulldozer is. I'm not talking about the whole bulldozer. I'm talking about pounds per square inch, how much you're pressing down the soil. So don't do it. If you can avoid being on the soil, avoid being on the soil. Okay, some of the perennials that we cut back are actually woody plants. This is Artemisia, losing all of these names. Absinthium. This is the wormwood Artemisia, and it's a shrub, but we grow it as a perennial. In the fall, before I took over this area, it was cut back, but left about 12 inches up. It's the fail-safe way to cut back a garden in the fall. If you aren't sure if it's going to grow back or not, then you cut it to 12 inches high and you watch it the next year. So somebody cut it back to 12 inches high. I looked at it and said, well, whatever you are there, however big you're going to get, you're too big because some of the plants around you are half dead from you laying on them. So I want you to be as small as you can be. So I went and cut this woody shrub, which is a woody evergreen. I cut it back to buds. Can you see the buds there? I cut it back to above some buds on each branch, all the way down. Took out the debris and cut those stems back. And in 3 weeks' time, that's what it looked like. In 3 weeks, sorry, I'm hitting the wrong buttons. In 3 weeks more, it looked like that. And I was already beginning to cut it off of some of the plants that it was leaning on. So do cut things back a little harder than you probably have been doing. I know I've gotten more brave at doing this over the years. This is perennial sage, cooking sage, which is the same as the Artemisia that I just showed you. It's a woody sub-shrub. Those are evergreen leaves. They tend to get burned off in our winter, but they grow back from those areas. And this is what I cut off of a sage plant. And there, if you look at the bottom of that one, see the buds? There are buds. I could have cut back to here. I didn't because I had other branches that could fill in. And the reason that I'm harsh on most of the evergreen subshrubs, that'd be sage, the artemisias, lavender, thyme, candy tuft, is most of them are Mediterranean plants. They don't belong in the Great Lakes, and they are used to a dry, hot summer. We don't have a dry, hot summer. We have a humid, hot summer. And these plants get sick. This bark that you see on here on the subshrub shouldn't have these breaks in it here and here. If I find it, here's one right here. This whole thing is stripped out. Those are cankers. Those are fungus infections. And they're there because it's humid in the summertime. The older this wood gets, the more canker it has on it, and the weaker it becomes. The more that you cut it back to encourage new wood to come from lower down, the more that you always have a lot of one-year wood that's not as badly infected and is livelier growing. So I'm cutting back to buds. So here's the shrub that I took those off of. This one right here. I left this much, and look how much is coming back 2 weeks later. It's budding out from all the places down near the ground where it still had lively growth. And that's what we wanted to grow from down there. Same thing with lavender. These lavenders I cut every single year for 20 some years, cut them all the way down in April. That's what they look like when I come to them in the 1st of April. That's what they look like when I go away. They're gone, or it looks like they're gone. I've just cut them down as far to the ground as I can because there are buds all the way down on this new wood. Very few branches here get canker. There's a split right there where they get it further up, but very few of these are going to get that. And the more I cut it down hard, the more that it's going to come back more lively. And they come back, there it is 2 or 3 weeks later. And there it is. This is the progression now. This is at the end of the year of that year. And they did bloom. They're going to stay there, and I'm going to cut them again the next year. And they're going to come back again. I've switched angles here, but they're going to come back again. They just keep doing it. They bloom, then we cut the flower stalks off. They bloom a little bit again, they grow a little bit again, and then we cut them off. If we want to keep them in the garden, that's what we do. Thyme is another woody sub-shrub. This is woolly thyme. It's a great ground cover and just a great character to have in the garden. And when it does some years is if you don't cut it back, it kills itself back. So see the rather ragged looking growth here? Some years, who knows exactly what it is in the winter, but some years they just die back and the branches die back. You can see them here. No, it's not salt. They don't use much salt at this particular street. It's because the winter was that way. This is in Southern California, in the high desert where we've got thyme at a client's place, and it died back and we cut out the parts that died back. It's just like cutting back a shrub heart. Here's a woolly thyme that's coming over the edge here and it's died back. The client said, oh, but it finally just covered the edge. I said, it covered the edge, but take a close look at those branches. If you look at this angle, can you see that there's green here, but there's no green here? These are dead branches. They need to be cut off. You want your new growth to come from a nice, strong growing place back there where there's green. So I cut them back to there. That's in April. And there they are in, I think that was the 4th week of June. No, of July, after the purple cone flowers blooming. So they do grow back. Boxwood, same way. We're often doing a lot of cutting of boxwood. This one's getting too big for the area that it's in. And it's also been pruned out of shape. It's got straight sides. The straighter the side on a shrub, the more that the top shades the bottom. And when the bottom gets shaded, it gets thinner and weaker. We want the top of a shrub to angle in. So that's what we want, and that's what I cut it to. I cut it and also thinned it. So some branches I've cut further back into the inside, the same as I did on the false cypress that I showed you as the first plant this year. And this is later that same year, filling in. Cutting back the herbaceous stuff and looking around for what might be going on. I'm going to cut back this Millennia, this blue racer, purple racer, sky. It's a Millennia caerulea, and the common name moorgrass, purple moorgrass that I'm cutting back has a hole next to it. I've got my fingers, 2 fingers stuck into the hole, and that's not a good thing. You look at the hole and go, what made that hole? A vole made that hole. A vole called the meadow mice. They eat the crowns of plants. Often, sometimes even the great big grasses that get so big that you can't even dig them out. A vole will chew through the crown of that and they'll just roll out of the ground. So I looked at that and said, well, I tugged on the grass seems to be okay, but the hole was angling down toward where a sign over here said Lilium fire alarm, and the lily was gone. It had eaten the lily. Voles and most of the predators that we've got in gardens are at their low ebb in April. If there is one vole in April, there can be, well, it should be 2. There can be 100 voles in August. It's called a vole year, a mouse year when that happens. And what you want to do is say, if there's voles here and they've done some damage, I need to think about taking care of them now, which would be in the case of voles setting out traps, mouse traps with a box on top of a box and a brick. They'll get under the box if you put some peanut butter in that trap and you can trap them. And if you've got a lot of voles and you're trapping in the season when things are already growing, then you might want to check that trap every day because you can trap a lot of voles in no short order. When I cut down grasses, this is a miscanthus grass in my garden. When I cut down big grasses that I've left up to look nice in the wintertime, when I'm ready to cut them down, I cinch them in. I tie them up into a bundle first. So Dominic and I are walking around the outside pulling tight on some bungee cords, cinching it in, because as you cut, it tends to fall and confuse what you've cut and what you haven't cut. And then we're going to cut it with loppers. You can also use a saw, or you can use a tool called a brush trimmer. You can buy one or you can rent one. It looks a little bit like a weed whip, but it's got a saw, an actual round circular saw at the end of the blade, and you can cut that down with that. But we usually just use our loppers, sometimes a saw. Then you can pick up the whole bundle as one bundle. And in this case, we were taking it to use it at the library for the decoration. I'll be at the Waterford Library tomorrow pruning if you want to come and ask questions in person. Amanda also helps out at the library. Some of the rest of you do. It's gardens that we planted 6 years ago now, designed and planted for the Waterford Township Library, and we take care of those gardens and some of the shrubs that are nearby. It's a lot of fun. We get there on the second Wednesday of every month. We're there at 4:30. We work for an hour and a half, get everything done that needs doing. We generally walk through together and talk about what we're going to do. And then we do it. And then afterwards, we go into the library and learn something. The second Wednesday of every month, if you want to come. There's no obligation. You don't have to be a member. You don't have to, you don't even have to bring any tools. If you want to just come and watch, that's fine. The more the merrier. Another thing you can be thinking about doing as you're cutting down is whether or not, in the case of this lavender hedge, it's gotten infiltrated by weeds that are coming up in the plant itself. And this one, they were old, they hadn't been cut back regularly, and they had grass in them. I lifted the whole hedge, cut all the lavenders back to the strongest wood that they had, took all the grass out of the bed, and let them grow back. See all the growth coming back? Don't worry about it. Cut first, worry later. And I tell people, just don't worry at all. This is one of my clients this is a Perodia. It's a pretty little tree that turns a nice color in the fall. And she asked me one year in the summer, she said, could we cut that back so that I wanted it to be an espalier on the wall between the windows. And the arborist that I had misunderstood me, and he took all the lower branches off, and I don't like it up there. I said, well, yeah, sure, we can cut it back. She said, well, when is a good time to do that? Well, this particular client was, at the time, 99 years old. And I said, Virginia, you always told me that you don't buy green bananas or wait for things. We're going to do it now when we think of it. So we cut it back in June. And here's the buds that have erupted in August. They came right out of the wood and grew back. So by the end of the year, it looked like this, down at the area we wanted it to be. We need to be more assertive and say, you need to live by my rules, plant. And if you can't live by my rules, then by gosh, I'm just going to take you out. So try it a little bit. I do. I have. And we've written about it. We write about what we do. We've heard from a number of people that, well, we don't do that. That's not the right way to do it. Well, it might not be the right way to do it, but it's the way that works to keep the garden going the way that we want to do them. Quite often we have people come back to us afterwards and say, okay, tell me when you did that and how you pulled that off. After we've done this kind of cutting down the perennial stuff and cutting down the woodies, now we rake. And I'm raking in order to be able to see better. Visibility is my whole objective. I'm not trying to remove the mulch. You'll read in some books that we should rake the mulch back in the spring. Don't. That's written by people who live in England and Scotland. They're 900 miles north of us. Their spring days are they don't get as warm as ours get. They don't get as direct sun. Their soil warms up better if it's darker, so they peel the mulch back in order to warm the soil up. Our soil goes from being cold to being warm real quickly. We don't need to do that, and we do need the mulch on the soil. So in this place here where these butterfly bushes are going to be cut down, there's some debris, some oak leaves and things that have accumulated in there that are extra that we don't really want to have in there. So we've cut down the butterfly bushes. This is the same place that you were just looking at. We've cut down the butterfly bushes and in the background, there's a couple of burning bushes that we're cutting down. It's Delicia and me. And now Delicia is raking up the debris. She's raking the twigs and things that we cut as we cut it down, not the mulch. Leave the mulch. So I'm raking with the rake. The rake I like to use in the spring is an expandable rake. You can make this narrower or wider. and it has tines that it's not a leaf rake. It's not going to grab everything it touches. It's going to grab the larger stuff for me. And I'm just raking out what I cut that fell as I cut it. And I'm leaving this. See, I've already raked back here. I'm leaving this debris in the middle. Then the next thing that I do in the spring, and we're well into that territory now, is you can put fertilizer down. And the fertilizer that I use is slow release organic fertilizer. What you want to use is something slow release, meaning carbon-based organic fertilizer. If I'm using a fertilizer that's salt-based, salt is simply a term for a chemical that dissolves. Anything that is salt-based that gives its nutrients to the plants as it dissolves into water is not going to be useful to plants at the time that they're most actively growing if you put it on this early. But slow release organic fertilizers that are carbon-based, the nutrients in them have to be acted on by microbes, by bacteria, by fungus, by larger animals, soil animals like worms and grubs. They work on the carbon source that's in the fertilizer, and they excrete the nutrients. So slowly, over a period of time, as the soil warms up, you get nutrients released to the plants, and you can put that fertilizer down as you've cleared the soil, as you've taken the weeds out, and before you're going to put mulch down on top of it. It's really a very good time to do it. It's also a very good time to talk about fertilizer phobia, which I'll do in a minute here. So I'm using a slow release salt fertilizer in this bed in April, once, Osmocote, which is its coating is going to be broken down slowly before the rest of it comes out. My choice in this case was to use a slow release salt based, like a coated material like Osmocote. Also, once is another name that's like this, because this particular bed that I'm taking care of at Michigan State is about 200 yards from the parking structure, and everything that I bring in, I have to wheelbarrow in. And a slow release salt-based fertilizer, like once, I can put on this bed, I can put 20 pounds of fertilizer, and that's enough. If I use an organic material, I'm going to be using 50 pounds. And in my case, it was a simple matter of how many pounds do I want to wheelbarrow all the way out to the bed. There's all different choices. I use a lot of Polytone in Michigan, which has some acid reaction substances in it, that the sulfur in it helps break down things in a high alkaline soil. I use a combination of dried blood and kelp and green sand in some gardens. These are all organic slow release fertilizers that you're looking at here: fish emulsion, seaweed, blood, cottonseed meal, you name it. And when I spread it before I'm weeding. So I've got weeds in here. I haven't done the edge yet, and I certainly haven't mulched yet. I'm spreading it out. It's slow release. It's not salt-based, so it's not going to burn the plants. It's not going to pull water out of their tissues. And so it doesn't matter if I have it a little bit heavier in one area than in another area. It's going to work just fine that way. And it's on the soil before I start digging to take the weeds out, before I start digging to divide plants. And as I dig to weed, as I dig to divide plants, as I dig to clean up the edge, the fertilizer is getting mixed into the soil. I don't have to do any separate operation to rake it in or scratch it into the soil. We've written some articles about fertilizer phobia where we show you the soil test results. They've changed now and they come to you by email from Michigan State, but the numbers are the same, where we tell you about what these numbers mean and how to match a fertilizer to it. We give you a spreadsheet that's a little worksheet that you can put your numbers in and figure out which one you're going to use. Because most gardeners that we know do not want to do math at all. And that's why on the notes that I gave you and the outline I gave you, it says, okay, 1 cup of a fertilizer that has a 10, 10, 10, has a 10 number as the first number. 1 cup for 10 square feet will work. 2 cups if it's a 5. because that makes it a little bit easier for you, but it doesn't make it perfect for your soil. We need to feed the soil, not the plants. It's not the individual plant that needs a different fertilizer. It's each of our soils is a little bit different, a little higher in nitrogen on one, a little lower in phosphorus on another. The soil that we have in our new gardens here at our new house, Steve and I, has almost no potassium in it, not a situation that we had at the old house. So we are looking for potassium sources, which in our case includes every banana peel that anybody in any of our family eats. My grandkids bring me banana peels and say, here, Grandma. So I chop them up and put them in the garden. Any potassium source I can put out there because I know that's what that soil needs. Now, what we do with our articles, new articles, we write directly on the internet. So they are searchable word by word through the internet. But our older articles that have, say, before 2006 or so are on PDFs. So this is an entire newsletter. It's about 14 pages and it's in a PDF where you go through the, if you do a search on our website, you'll find the magazine's table of contents, and you'll then be able to download the magazine and read that piece of it. Okay, so it has things like lawn grubs. This is not the time of year to deal with lawn grubs, not. And most of the time when people think they're dealing with lawn grubs, they're not. They're dealing with grass that was stressed or burned out from being too directly directly in the sun and not watered well enough. There's a lot of other things that go on there. Okay, I think because I know that there's got to be questions and we're getting to where we're running out of time, we'll save edging the bed and moving forward for either some later time when we can meet together, or you can take a look at the outline. It says exactly what to do. Edge the bed, cut the edge first, loosen and lift the slice, make sure that the edge is right before you weed the bed, and you can work your way all the way through there. So what questions are there, and what can we do for anybody who's in the webinars that I do on Saturdays for our website? And you're welcome to join us. I think this weekend after this, the 26th, we've got one on pruning overgrown shrubs that we're opening up to the world. You're welcome to come. And in our webinars, we tell people you can press the button that says raise hand. You'll pop to the top of the list, and Amanda or someone can give you the go ahead to turn your microphone on, and you can voice your question, or you can right now put it into chat. And I'm seeing in chat right now, I'm probably behind. How long should you wait before you're pruning to protect the beneficial insects? Is a great question, Gina, and is a question that I ask myself every year and will until the year I die. I leave up in a good portion of our garden is meant entirely for butterflies and pollinators. That's the purpose of that whole strip. And so we leave everything up until the very last, the things that we cut down in the spring, which means that they're the ones that take us the longest to cut down because we're cutting around new growth. In some of those areas where I worry about whether the neighbors are going to turn us in because they're out by the road, we want our neighbors to see the butterflies and pollinators. In some of those areas, I cut them now, and I loosely bundle the branches that I've cut and the stems that I've cut, and I leave them in the garden. I prop them up behind the mailbox or over by the telephone pole because I want to leave them for as long as possible. But there's no number you're going to find anywhere, no calendar date that says at this point, all of the beneficial insects that left their eggs or overwintering larvae on these plants are out. We just don't know. But it's a great question. I'm seeing a question from best time to cut back burning bushes. Diana's asking that. And you can cut a burning bush back anytime. They're going to sprout from below your cut if they were healthy. And you would know an unhealthy burning bush once you start cutting it, because you'd get into the middle of the bush and you'd find lots of dead wood. If you don't find lots of dead wood, if it's a good viable burning bush, even if the trunks are as big around as my ankle, you can saw through them, wait a little while, and they'll sprout out. If you want to have people not notice that you cut the burning bush back, that happens sometimes at people's house when they go to their parents' houses or their sisters' houses, or then cut them back now before things bud out. Nobody misses bare branches at this time of year. Cut them all the way down. They will sprout out, and they'll be 18 inches tall by the 1st of June. And then somebody will say, wasn't there a bigger shrub there? Seems like there was. by the end of the year, they'll be 3 feet tall. They'll be just as beautiful as can be. So there's no perfect time, but for me, if I want to get away with something, or I want to see the biggest return in the shortest amount of time, I'm going to cut them back in late March or the 1st of April. One of the things are here.
Okay, yeah, we had a question about pruning lavender.
Yes.
Somebody had a plant that was 4 or 5 years old and they've never pruned it before. Can they still prune that, or has that ship already sailed?
That's a good question too. Just like the old ones that I dug up and replanted in there, I had to look at each branch and say, are there any buds? And I cut each branch back as far as I could. And because some of them were so old and scraggly, and if I didn't see any buds far down, I put them back in the ground and I buried that branch. I said, grow some roots then, so that you can be a better contributor to the plant. So just, you have to look and see. If it's been 4 or 5 years, is not a long time for lavender. Lavender can live decades, but in 4 or 5 years, it may have started dying back at the base and you might not see any buds, in which case you're going to cut back further out this first year and watch for the new growth that comes, and you'll see that more new growth comes the next year and you cut back further the next year.
Okay. I guess along those same lines, I had a question. If you have a lavender that you're planning on transplanting this spring, should you cut it all the way back, or
Sure.
They won't care?
Yeah, if you're transplanting something and you want it to grow well in the new place, you want it to be as lively looking in the new place as you would have in the old place. And I am going to assume in most cases when people are moving a plant that they're moving it to an equally good place or a better place. So it's going to do the same thing there. I cut them back.
Okay. And then we had a question about if you could discuss pruning forsythia.
Forsythia, we did put pictures up, and I'm trying to think whether or not those pictures were on one of our free webinars of a neighbor's forsythia just a few weeks ago. You can see the flower buds on forsythia. On a forsythia branch, the buds are in pairs, like on a viburnum, but the leaf buds are in pairs, and if there are flower buds, there's 2 buds. So you'll see clusters of buds together. So on a forsythia, if it's going to bloom really well, if those buds survived winter and all up along the branch, there's all pairs of paired buds together, then I'll wait until it blooms and then cut the living daylights out of it, cut it all the way down to the ground. There's one forsythia in one garden that I've taken care of over the years that is behind a Japanese maple, and we're using it as a screen for the Japanese maple in the winter so the wind doesn't get to it. So we let the forsythia grow up, we let it bloom, and then we cut it all the way down to the ground every year. On the website, in at least one place, we have a sequence of pictures of a forsythia that we do that to in Detroit, that there's not room for it to get big. So every year we let it bloom and then we cut it all the way back. If you don't care if it's going to bloom, or if it's lost its flower buds, which happens in exposed winters sometimes, if you don't see any flower buds on it, go ahead and cut it all now. Or if you don't care if it blooms, cut it back, let it just grow back. I will hope that you're not where my dad was when I was a kid. I remember my mother being very upset at my dad that he'd cut a forsythia in the backyard all the way down to nothing and it didn't come back. And I remember my dad standing there saying, well, Kissinger said it would come back. Well, yeah, Mr. Kissinger was a great gardener, but Mr. Kissinger had a garden in his yard. He didn't have a yard that had been packed down to concrete by 7 kids and all of their friends running around the forsythia bush. So it wasn't a healthy forsythia. So if it's a healthy forsythia, it's going to come back. If it's not a healthy forsythia, you haven't lost anything by cutting it back, except to find out that maybe I should get a different kind of shrub for in here.
And then we also had a question on when the latest is that you can prune a late blooming hydrangea.
The latest you can prune a late blooming hydrangea. I've got some in Boston that over the years, depending on when I could get there to work, I could cut them back in April, or I had to wait until they were already growing. And the only difference it made in cutting them back, say, all the way until the 2nd or 3rd week of May, was that they bloomed even later. It delayed the bloom more to cut them back further. I don't know if I would cut them back in June and expect them to do much blooming, because they probably wouldn't make their flower buds until October. But it's just going to delay the bloom. It's not going to stop them from blooming.
And
And
then we
those
also
are
had,
the late blooming hydrangeas. Those are the panicle hydrangeas with the conical clusters on them. The ones with the round clusters that are white, you can also cut all the way back and they'll bloom this year. But the round clusters that are pink or blue and the oak leaf hydrangeas that have the cool bark, those are blooming on last year's wood, and those you just thin out. You don't cut the tips off, all the tips off, or you cut off all the blooming parts of the plant.
then we also had,
Yeah,
we
go
had
ahead.
somebody asking about pruning butterfly bushes and if there's any similarity to that as the hydrangeas.
The butterfly bush, if we're talking about Buddleia davidii, the butterfly bush that most people grow, there are some other kinds and some hybrids too, is blooming on brand new wood every year. There's no parallel to the hydrangeas. There's just the one bloom. They bloom on new wood. If I'm going to grow those at all in a garden, I like them to grow as a vase. I like all of the branches to come up from the ground and spread themselves out in a pretty spray. So I cut them all the way down to the ground. I just cut them. You can walk on them after we cut them. You could saw Delicia with her rake was walking on the butterfly bushes we cut down. And that's because if I let them come back from old wood and branch out from old wood, they become bushy and twiggy and crisscrossed with each other. They don't have the clean lines. So it's up to you. You can wait like they're a rose bush and see how much of them survive the winter and just cut back to good wood. But if you do, you're not going to get the clean lines. You might get a little bit earlier bloom on them. I just prefer to cut them all the way back.
Okay, and I think that's most of the questions we had from the chat, but if anybody else had any questions they wanted to chime in on, feel free to ask away.
Margie Hopkins is asking which hydrangeas you know that you can cut. How do you know which hydrangeas to cut to the ground and which not to? Round white blooms, the snowball hydrangeas, you can cut them all the way to the ground if you want to. Panicle white hydrangeas that bloom late in the summer, like Limelight and Fire Glow and the rest of those that are popular right now, those you can cut all the way back. All the rest of the hydrangeas are hydrangeas that the tip bud is the one that is old enough to start growing again this year and bloom in 2 or 3 months. So the tip buds have to make it through the winter. The gardener can't cut them off. Winter can't cut them off. Deer can't cut them off. If they cut them off, it's not going to bloom. But the gardener can thin out and take old branches out and leave new branches. As long as the tip is there, they're going to bloom. Mary Lou wants to know about pruning an overgrown Weigelia. Well, Weigelia is a member of the honeysuckle family, and they're all crazy plants. They don't know to stop growing. They don't know how to organize their branches. So they're not an easy thing to approach, but I go into them when they're bare now. And the first thing I do is go into the inside, like on those hydrangeas that I showed you, and I take out old wood. I cut some old branches right down to the ground. Then I look at what's left and shorten it in order to have strong growth coming from the branches that are there. If I want it to be real small, like the one in my garage that I'd rather not be there at all, I might cut it all the way to the ground, but they're going to bloom. They have a longer bloom period if you don't cut them all the way back, because they can bloom on wood that grew last year a little earlier than they can bloom on new wood. So I approach it as with no leaves on it, take out old wood first and then shorten what's left. Can we continue with edging? People want to know. Well, I guess that depends on timing here, because it's your meeting, Master Gardeners, and you asked me in. We started at 6:30, 6:45, and we've been at this now an hour. So I don't want to run anybody over, but we can continue with edging if you'd like.
If you want to take 10, 15 minutes, I think, unless anybody objects. Before though we get into that, I know we did have a message from Julie about membership. I was wondering maybe we can sneak that in real quick so that if there's anybody that needs to get going, they can get that message and then we can go back to edging. Does that sound good?
Sounds good to me. And anybody who doesn't want to, well, that's nice about Zoom. Nobody knows that you left.
Exactly.
Click the leave button.
Yeah, Julie, did you want to make your membership statement real quick and then? Are you still here with us, Julie? Maybe I lost Julie in the scheme of things.
Okay, well.
Oh, I guess continue with edging and we'll check in with Julie at the end of that. So.
All right. Margie is asking if I'm pruning a ginkgo tomorrow. Yes, we have a dwarf ginkgo. We're trying to keep dwarf at the library garden tomorrow. So we're working there tomorrow doing that. Okay, so we'll go back to screen here and we'll talk about edging. Sorry, I have to get my screen to start paying attention to me again. I edge, I like an air edge. You can also have a hard edge, a plastic to keep roots from coming in and roots from going out. I prefer an air edge if I can because my beds, I'm always kind of refining their shape. But either way works that you're going to clean up the edge this time of year. This grass grew into the bed last fall and is sprouting now, its tops. Meanwhile, it has reached further into the bed and it's growing in. It's not unusual for grass and many plants to grow 18 inches into a bed over the winter time, and they become the worst weeds that you've got. So you always start on the edge where most of your weeds come from and weed the edge first. And I weed by cutting an edge. That's what the edge looks like when I get done. It is an air edge. You leave it exposed to air. Roots don't grow into air, so you leave it exposed to air and then it slopes up into the bed. And to do that, I use a spade. Some people use a half moon edger. I use a spade because I want to cut as deep as the roots are that are going in. And in some of the beds that I deal with, the roots are quackgrass roots and they go a lot deeper than regular grass roots. But I slice along the edge. So I've started here and I'm slicing. I'm not making this bed bigger. I'm just slicing right along the edge that already exists. I'm pushing down on the spade, and each time I push down, I push back on the spade handle, which moves the blade up of the shovel up in and loosens this area right here. And I'll cut for about 10 feet. And then I stop, lean down, grab that edge that I cut and lift up everything that's there, roots attached, shake it, take the soil off of it and take it out of there, throw it out behind me. If anything snaps, if you feel anything go click, then it broke a root that was running into the bed and you chase it. That's when I take my fork, I put the fork in, bend it back and loosen and pop up this one that broke away. And when I chase that one in, see how far that was going into the bed. It would be right in the middle of that salvia. It would be entangled in the roots of the salvia and I'd have to lift the whole plant to take it out. But if I get it in the fall or in the spring when I'm edging, I can keep the edge clean. So that's how far, and that's just regular lawn grass. That's not weed quackgrass that many of us have. That's plain old bluegrass going into the bed. This has quackgrass coming into the bed that I'm going to edge right here. Whoops. It's funny, I thought I had the rest of the pictures there, but it's a cut edge here. Take me just about as long. My edge is deeper here because the grass roots are growing in at a deeper level. It doesn't, I've had a number of people, especially professional landscapers, who say, we can't do that. That's too crazy. Takes too much time. This bed has 100 linear feet of edge. And I started here where I showed you a picture a few minutes ago. I started here. This is 1 hour later. I've gone all the way around the bed. And because I'm chasing roots as I go that come from the edge, and because most of the weeds come from the edge in, if you can look and see the disturbed soil here and behind me, I've weeded most of the bed in that hour's time. So it doesn't take time. It just takes attention and discipline to say, I'm going to do this edge first. Sometimes the edge doesn't hold as well. This is a very sandy soil and the edge tends to crumble quite a bit. That might be a place where you'd want to use a hard edge, but it's also a place where you pile the soil up further as you go. I'm also dealing with a different weed that's creeping in here. This lawn is infested with, sour sorrel. It's got another name. It's a polygonum, and I can't think of what its other name is. This is a creeper that has a very shallow, almost elastic, fine, thin root system that you would think, oh, I've got it. But every one of the little elastic pieces that snaps can come up and keep on growing. So I'm looking at it coming out of the lawn. It's growing in the lawn and it's creeping into the bed and it's exploding in the bed. It's going, wow, great place. I'm going to cut along this edge the same way as I do with grass. I'm going to cut and lean back and loosen. And then knowing that that plant has gone here and further into the bed, there's its leaves. They turn a different color. See the purplish leaves? They're growing in to the rest of the bed. And that's my edge way back there. They're purple leaves that are here. I'm going to take my fork and loosen that whole area and chase every root. And you can you can be accused of being obsessive, of being a fanatic. Go ahead and let people say that. If you clean the bed well in the beginning of the year this way, you don't have to weed the rest of the year. But here's what those sour sorrel roots were doing. Thin roots, they'll snap in a second as you pull on them, but look at how there's a shoot coming up all along the way. If you don't get them out, you haven't done anything. You might as well get a goat and just harness it in that area. So I loosen the whole area with the fork. I know that they're in there. I know that they're as far as that piece of grass where the purple leaves were showing. So I'm chasing them all the way into the bed. You can see why I put my fertilizer on first. That fertilizer is getting mixed in everywhere here now. And that's what came out of that area that I showed you just a few minutes ago. All of those roots, all of those runners, all attached. Then I weed the bed. Now I've had a good look at the bed as I've been cutting things down, and I've edged the bed, and I'm going to weed it now to focus on the weeds, the established weeds. I'm not so much worried about the seedlings. The little tiny things coming up, I can kill those by putting mulch on top of them. But the established weeds, the ones that are becoming spreading colonies inside the bed, are the ones that I'm concerned about. So I saw those as I was cutting things down, and I'm going to go into the bed, into the center of the bed, to where I saw there were weeds. I'm going to loosen that area, take the weeds out, move backwards, take the weeds out, move backwards, and I've loosened the bed. I stepped into here, loosened the middle, step back, loosened here, step back, loosened here. So the whole bed gets fluffed up as I work. And if you keep the edge weeded, you don't have very many weeds in the middle of the bed because the weeds start from the edge of the bed and move their way in. You'll find some dandelions that escaped you. Not a big problem because it's just one tap root. It's not like that's a spreading colony. You'll sometimes find thistle that you have to start in the middle of the colony. I start in the middle of the colony and I work outward. I never start at the edge because there's always an extension beyond the edge, and I can find it better if I start from the older plants and work my way outward. If you knew the weed was there last year, then you know the weed is there this year. This is Canada thistle, pieces coming up from the roots early in the year, and they're growing great guns when they've got just the tiniest bit of green showing, just a little bit of bud of green. You need to loosen the soil and get them all out. This is nut sedge. There's the nut that gives nut sedge its name. You knew it was there. All you got to do is loosen and find it. And this one is connected. This smaller one is connected to this bigger one. It's connected to this one here. You'll find them. This is scouring rush or horsetail. Tim won the, we had a running competition with the people that worked with me for years of who would get the longest unbroken weed root. And Tim won it this year on 6 feet, 5 inches of unbroken horsetail root that he chased through the bed. The weeds that I find most often in perennial gardens are the plants that we put in there themselves that have spread out. When I was cutting back in this area of this garden, something that you just can't see on the camera, but your eye could see it. I was cutting back these cardinal flowers. See the bright red? Earlier, 3 weeks earlier than this picture, when I cut those back, I saw the bright red, but I also saw here and there little bits of green coming up. I said, well, what are you coming up? I didn't recognize it as the sprout of any weed that I knew. Well, then I moved over to cut back Carolina lupin, and I realized, oh, it's the Carolina lupin spreading into the cardinal flower area. Now, the cardinal flower has almost all of its foliage down low for most of the year, and then it shoots up stems 3 feet tall to give you bright red flowers at the end of summer. It's a very nice thing to have in a garden, but not if an early grower like Carolina lupin, Thermopsis, which gets 4 feet tall and is leafy the whole way, comes in and smothers it early in the year. So I need to get the thermopsis out of there. It's a weed. So I'm edging the thermopsis. I'm putting my spade in, just like I do the edge, put it in, lean back and loosen the area. And all of that came out of right there. That's not an accumulation from the right and the left, and that's all what was right underground right there, heading for the lobelias area, the cardinal flowers area, and going to smother it. So I've edged all around the thermopsis, and I'm chasing from the older part of the plant out to the younger part of the plant. And in this case right here, the one that I'm chasing, every one of those buds is a 4-foot tall stem if it's got sun to grow into out from beyond the main plant. And this one, as I got to it, it was running into the cardinal flower. So this is the cardinal flower. From this angle, they don't look as red, but that's red leaves there. These things that are shooting right through the root ball, those are Thermopsis Carolina lupin roots. And each of those is going to try to kill this plant. So if I lift up the cardinal flower and pull the weed out from underneath, it has no resistance. It can't fight me. It's a lot easier. And I can put that cardinal flower back into the ground this time of the year, and it will just continue doing what it's doing. See how white these roots are? These are all brand new roots. These are not roots that spent there the whole winter. These are roots that this little bit of green, this new growth right here, is fueling that growth of roots. If I lift this cardinal flower up, take the Carolina lupin out of it and put it back in again, it is just going to grow gangbusters, because that's what it's doing right now. And that's what all your plants are doing. Dig up a daisy, dig up this is a piece of a crocosmia. Lucifer is the popular one. That's new root. That was not there 3 weeks ago. And that's what you want to get up out of the weeds and then back into a weed-free bed quickly so that it can continue doing that. Once you're done weeding, and so now the interior of the bed is weeded. Not everywhere were there weeds. There were some weeds here. There were some weeds further down here. Now I'm raking again, mostly to find my weeding tools and my pruners. But I'm cleaning up the edge, just taking out what I threw out in the way of weeds, and they're going to go to the compost. Then I can come back, and I come back 3 weeks later. This is what that bed looks like. This area that you're going to see me squatting in is right here. There's very little of anything showing there now. When I come back in 3 weeks, there it is. And the only place I have to weed is in between plants where I didn't put mulch. It's the only place that the weeds can grow. Everything else is up and filling its area and growing with great vigor. In June of that year that I'm showing you here, that's all the weeds that were in 500 square feet of bed. That's all that I weeded out. And that's the way that it should be in a garden. We should be able to have fun in June and July, not be crawling around brushing soil off of our foreheads as we dig our way through a thistle clump or whatever else it is that we left in the springtime. So there we go. That takes you through edging, and we won't go into dividing tonight. Let's wait until it's a little bit warmer out.
We just had a couple more questions while you're doing the edging presentation. One was tool for cutting. What tools do you use for cutting into old wood inside of a bush?
I usually use loppers or a saw. And when it comes to a saw and it's a crowded, congested old bush, sometimes you have to cut several times. You have to cut at an angle down and then at the opposite angle down in order to get down to where you can make some room. Once you make the first incursion, once you make a little bit of space, then it becomes easier to use a saw. And I like to use the saw better because it doesn't require as much maneuvering as loppers do.
And then we also had somebody ask, do you edge more than once per year?
I generally edge beds twice a year, in the spring and in the fall. If I'm working with somebody who wants the look of a sharp hot knife through butter, as one of my clients put it, then I might weed more often than that, but I'm not edge more often than that. But I'm not going to edge that same way. Then I'm just going to trim that edge. At one garden in England, where Stephen and I interviewed the gardener, they do 5 miles of edging every year, and they cut the beds every fortnight. So every 2 weeks, they come through with a trimmer and trim the grass at the edge of the bed. but they only edge, like I showed you now, twice a year.
And then we had somebody ask, how do you get Creeping Charlie out of your beds?
Creeping Charlie is the same problem as the sour sorrel that I showed you that I was chasing. It has a creeping root. It's shallower than sour sorrel, which is kind of nice. But it does come from the lawn and explodes into the bed once it gets its head out and doesn't have any competition from the grass. So I have to edge along the bed and peel it up from the oldest plants in toward the youngest plants and chase the pieces that break. Unfortunately, with Creeping Charlie, it's still in the lawn and it's still going to be growing very vigorously even during the warm weather, unlike sour sorrel. So I'll often have to come through and edge again or kill the lawn. And that's about the only way to get Creeping Charlie out of the lawn. Kill off the lawn, smother it, or if you use herbicide, if you're okay with herbicide, you can use a herbicide. But I have to kill that area where the Creeping Charlie is, and to start off with lawn that doesn't have Creeping Charlie in it. It's a tough weed. Creeping Charlie is also called ground ivy, gill over the ground. It's Glaucoma Herbaceous, and it's a tough weed, very tough weed.
And then we had another person asking about clover. Similar question. How do you deal with an abundance of clover as a weed?
Of clover? Clover spreads primarily by seed. So if I have a lot of clover in the bed, then I have clover in the lawn going to seed. I kind of suspect that you're not looking at clover, you're looking at one of the oxalises. Try looking up oxalis. A lot of people look at the leaf, which looks a little like a clover leaf, and they think, oh, it's clover. And there are three kinds of oxalis, one that has a creeping root system, one that spreads by, and two others that spread mostly by seed. So you need to figure out which one you have, and then you'll know whether you need to loosen the whole area and go after all of the running roots, which are thin and viable all through their length, or whether you have to just get it early enough in the year before it goes to seed and spreads itself further into the bed.
And then I'll probably make this our last two questions, I guess. One is how to get rid of wild garlic and onion, and because it's in all of their lilies. In our chat.
That's one of the worst weeds we have. Weed bulbs are the worst category of weeds we deal with. They're worse than any of the running weeds. And the wild onion is one of the worst because it pretends to be something else. We dig it out, and you learn to identify the bulb, if nothing else, by the smell, because it'll pretend to be other kinds of bulbs sometimes. We weed it out, dig it out, and we dig it repeatedly. It usually takes 2 to 3 years to get it out of the bed. If it's established and well established in a garden so that it's all over throughout an area, we might have to make the whole area be fallow, smother the whole area for 2 or 3 years in order to get a jump on that plant. There's no good answer to it. It's a tough weed to get rid of.
And then I did have somebody asking if you could just repeat the timetable for the library garden club tomorrow.
The library garden club that we have at the Waterford Township Library in Waterford Township, Michigan. I don't know how far away people are listening from. Is on the second Wednesday of every month. Well, we don't meet in December in most years, but we do meet outside from March through November, the second Wednesday of each month at 4:30 in front of the garden, in front of the library. You can't miss us. It's the people with the buckets and the shovels and the rakes and stuff. And we garden from 4:30 to 6. Then we go inside and we learn something from somebody each time we meet at about 7 o'clock inside the library.
Well, thank you so much for a great presentation, Janet. I know we had people knocking at the door to get in. So many people wanted to hear from you today, and I think
That's
people
great.
really learned a lot.
I'm glad. It's that time of year, isn't it? That all of us want to be out in the garden and get to doing stuff. I'm so, especially after 2 years of not seeing people for so long, it's so nice to see that people are getting together again and are talking to each other, and it's exciting. It's just making my blood boil. It really is. Thank you for asking me to be here, and join me sometime over at gardenataz.org. You can send an email to me that way. See you all later.
Well, thank you so much, Janet. And then Julie, if you're still on, if you wanted to make that announcement, if you're still around, I don't know.
I am here.
Ah, there you are.
Hi, I just want to let everybody know, this is Julie Bird, and I want everybody to know that I am working on getting all of the checks copied this week and confirming any recertifications. If any of you did not include a recertification with your application, I have acknowledged anybody who emailed them to me. So that's covered if you got an email or if you sent copies. I will let anybody know if I did not receive the proper paperwork for confirmation. So just wanted to let you know that was going on, and I will coordinate with our new treasurer and see if we can do a check handoff shortly and get all those checks cashed for you.
Well, thanks
And
everybody.
that,
Thanks everybody for
Yeah.
joining us tonight. And thanks again, Janet, for a wonderful presentation.
it was
Glad to
great.
have been here.
Thanks, Janet.
I put those links back into the chat if you want to grab them before you leave, whoever was asking for those.
And we'll make sure to send those out as well with the recording once it's
Okay.
up. So
See you later.
we'll see you later.
Okay, bye, everybody. And thanks again for helping with the recertification information.